Hanks. I'm a hydrogeologist. I'm here with Adam Malling, who's a hydrogeologist also, and we've been working on this for the last half year or so. This is what's called a LiDAR image, and it shows detailed topography, and I'll get to why showing that in a second. The landfill is located just south of the transfer station. You can actually kind of see, if you're familiar with the site, where the loop is, where you drive. That's the building. This outline here shows the old landfill. The reason it shows up on this image is that because of the earthwork that went back on here when they were landfilling it, the topography is a little bit bumpy, so it shows up. We believe it's filled mostly with residential trash, and that's based on the fact that that's what the township was supposed to take, but more importantly, we've looked at the groundwater chemistry and some different things that you see with industrial waste, and we don't see that. We see some PFAS contamination, but we don't see what are called volatile organic compounds, VOCs for instance. We don't see metals contamination, stuff you often see with more industrial type landfills. So I believe it's residential. The area, if you're familiar with the transfer station, is currently wooded. I had no idea that there was any kind of dump back there. In early 2023, Jeff Marcinkowski, I always screw that up, the township supervisor, called Eagle and said, "Are you aware we have an old dump here, and should we be looking at it?" So Eagle suggested that they get an environmental consultant and do some work on it, and that's how we got involved. So what have we done so far? We started out by reviewing everything we could find on it, all the Eagle files, the public domain files regarding the site, records of how trash was, when it was used, records on the geology that we could find. We mapped the boundaries of the historical landfill, what I was just showing you. We did that by, first with LiDAR, which I showed you the detailed topography. We went out and we installed 4 shallow monitoring wells encircling the landfill. We didn't know which way groundwater was flowing. Peter Van Hees, working on it at the time, thought it was flowing to the south-southwest. He turned out to be right. So we used the monitoring wells to determine the direction of groundwater flow. As I said, groundwater flows to the south-southwest. We sampled the groundwater from the monitoring wells for VOCs. I was just talking about the volatile organic compounds, metals and PFAS compounds. VOCs and metal concentrations are pretty much all non-detect. I believe they all are non-detect. I think we had a small show of zinc, but it is naturally occurring kind of numbers. PFAS compounds, PFO and PFOS, were found above Eagle criteria and MW3 for drinking water, and MGSI for that matter. MW3 is the downgradient monitoring well there.
What's downgradient?
It's just like a downgradient a river. It's the way the groundwater is flowing. Okay, so after we saw that in MW3, talking to Eagle, we identified 10 downgradient, down towards groundwater flow, residential water wells that we wanted to test and requested permission. To date, we have sampled 7. That's because we got permission to sample 7 of the 10, and they are all well below Eagle drinking water criteria. We also, because MW3, the downgradient well, is adjacent to the property to the south, we gave that property owner what's called a notice of migration to let them know that we suspect or that PFAS is moving onto their site, their property. This is the same slide that Matt showed, but I'll still show it again. These are the 4 monitoring wells, what we call MW1, MW2, MW3, MW4. That yellow circle comes from both walking the site plus that LiDAR I showed you. So here's what you guys probably are used to, and me, where you dump your leaves and such. This is looking at the 4 monitoring wells. We went out and, of course, surveyed their elevation. Once you survey a well's what's called top of casing, you can measure how far down the groundwater is and convert that into groundwater elevation. And just like a river, it flows downhill. So if you follow the contours from high to low, groundwater is flowing perpendicular to those contours and is flowing that way. The aquifer here is a nice fine sand. It's a very clean sand. It's what we're all used to seeing around here, lake bottom sand, a dune sand, such very clean sand. So no surprises there, and that's makes our job easier because there's not a lot of, when you get a lot of changes in sediment types, it can affect how groundwater flows, and we don't have that. It's a very clean sand. As Matt mentioned, we sampled residential wells, which we determined to be down gradient, and this duplicates kind of what he showed. There's the landfill itself and the monitoring wells, if you can see those. 7 of the 10 wells we wanted to sample are shown here. These are all non-detect. We had a couple hits, small hits, 3 parts per trillion, below drinking water criteria to the south. This well I marked out the distance to is 860 feet. This property here has no wells on it, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing next and delineation, but very happy obviously that the closest wells were unimpacted. So as far as the future environmental investigation goes, and keep in mind this is kind of an iterative process. You sometimes have to adjust what you're doing based on what you find. But right now, what I want to do is go out and, as I mentioned, the monitoring wells we have are fairly shallow. I want to drill a deep well adjacent to MW3, and in that deep well sample groundwater at different intervals to see how deep the impact goes. Right now we don't know. So once we get that information, it'll help us determine also not only how far down that contamination goes, but what the vertical gradient is. We know groundwater flows downhill and it's flowing in a horizontal way, south-southwest, but does groundwater also have a vertical component? We can see that by nesting monitoring wells one below the other. If they've got the same groundwater elevation in them, groundwater flows pretty much all horizontal. If this is higher at depth, groundwater is flowing up. If it's less elevation at depth, groundwater is going down. So we want to determine that. That'll help us figure out what groundwater could be doing and the contaminants it carries. So based on those things, the extent we see of PFAS with depth and also that vertical gradient, we'll pick a drilling method to use to look down gradient. There's a couple different ways to drill, several different ways to drill, and part of that decision process on how you're going to do it is based on how deep you have to go. So that's going to be what we determine from drilling that deep well. So once we determine that, we're going to go out and go down gradient and obviously close in at first and probably where we suspect the plume is, and drill wells and sample groundwater. And right now we have permission to move on, access the property to the south, so we're going to work there first. And as needed, if needed, we'll seek access to properties further and further down gradient and move that way. So based on those findings, we'll kind of determine the next step. So it's, that's the first step, is to delineate this thing. See if there is danger that, you know, is it going deeper or what? I mean, right now we've done the important or most important thing and looked at residential wells, and now we're going to try to get a handle on exactly where this thing is. And by doing that, we'll have knowledge about whether anything's at risk, such as Duck Creek or Duck Lake, or could a future residential well be impacted if it was drilled in a different place. Questions?
You mentioned that the current wells you have are fairly shallow, 50 feet?
No, they're on the order of 15, 20 feet deep or so.
Okay, and then.
And groundwater itself is, about 8 feet down or so.
Oh, okay.
So it's relatively shallow.
How far do you figure these new wells that you'd have to, or that you're gonna use?
I think we'll probably, just as a matter of course, probably go to at least 60 feet. If we were to find that we still had impact at that depth, we'd want to go deeper.
Okay.
Sometimes you run into people out here, the sand is such a nice water producer that people don't drill deep very often, you don't need to. So you'll drill either till you kind of run out of contamination, you get to clean, or you find a competent clay layer that would not allow groundwater to move deeper. So that's kind of the criteria of how deep we'll go.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
So this kind of ties into my question earlier. So that's how you determine if it's staying in place or if it's migrating, the drilling the deeper well, okay, and all that. And
Yes, it's oftentimes if you have horizontal flow in an aquifer, you won't get a lot of vertical. At least close in, it just tends to move horizontally. So part of what we'll be looking at in the deep well, by setting a deep well and a shallow well right there, is what is the elevation, groundwater elevation difference in them. And if it does show a vertical down or downward flow, that'll be one reason why we'd probably look deeper. Anything else? Well, thank you.
Thank you.